Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back. Today we are going to kind of finalize the finishing work on this beautiful ash burl top telecaster kit. I just love this thing. It's looking awesome. It's got some very deep pores, so even with a few coats of lacquer, they're not quite filled in. I did seal it, but it didn't quite do the job. Now, I couldn't really grain fill this because I was really focused on keeping this looking the way it did after my video where I did a little bit of bronze, goldish stuff in it. And well, there was a whole video on finishing this top and it was fun. Anyway, so that's what we've got going on the front, and then the back is fully sealed. It looks good. It's got this semi-transparent kind of shifting gold, which I showed you guys how to do in the last video. So it's pretty much opaque from some angles, but really easy to see the green, or the grain rather, pretty transparent from others. Okay, so in this one, we're going to flat sand this, and then we're going to add a few more coats to finish it off. Then we're going to get into the polishing process. I'm also going to show you how to turn one of these awesome leveling beams. These are for fretwork. I showed that as well, how to do the fretwork, but I'm going to show you how to turn this into a level sanding tool for a guitar, which is very straightforward. And it's going to help us when it comes time to do the polishing and all of that, to get this thing nice and flat. I'm going to jump into voiceover because it's kind of loud in here, like I said, from that machine. Did I say that? We're doing some machining over there. Anyway, I'm going to jump into voiceover, show you how I do this, and yeah, let's get the finishing done on this guy. So to get started here, we're going to get our leveling beam set up. We're selecting some paper. I've got 1000 grit and 2000 grit wet dry that I'm going to use. I'm just using the beam to act as a guide to cut the paper so that it'll cover the entire side. And you'll notice I'm using the wider side of the beam so I get more sandpaper surface area. I've checked that the wide sides of this beam are machined flat, so no problems there. That'll allow me to do the work a little bit faster. I'm covering the sides of the beam in masking tape so that I don't get glue on them, and then I'm using just some 3M Super 77 spray adhesive on the back of the paper. So once the back of the paper is covered in this and you don't have to spray it crazy heavy, wait 30 seconds and then go ahead and press down as well as you can basically, and the beam will stick on there nicely. This is kind of like the masking tape and super glue trick, except, well, it doesn't use super glue for one thing, and also we don't need to mask the back of the sandpaper obviously. So this is the easy way to go ahead and apply something like this. Makes for great temporary sanding beams and stuff like that, and then you can pull this stuff off and use it as a leveling beam again. Now, of course, I don't want to waste a bunch of sandpaper, and it's already sticky, so I just go ahead and take a couple pieces of MDF here and make myself a couple corner sanding blocks by sticking the edge that I've got on one side and then folding it over. So you'll see me do that real quick. These might come in handy later. They certainly come in handy for some things. I'm not 100% sure if they'll come in handy for guitars, but I think they will. Might be a good application in fretwork or something. Not sure yet. Anyway, now I've got my beam set up. I've got 1000 grit on one side and 2000 on the other side. So I'm going to start with the 1000 grit side, of course, to help level this out a little bit. And then I'm going to move to the 2000 grit side to kind of finish it off. And then I'm going to go ahead and spray again. Now I'm going to put another couple coats on here because I don't want this grain on the front of the guitar to be crazy deep. But I am going to leave some of it because it's a beautiful ash burl top and I don't want to fill it all in and make it perfectly smooth. I want it to have that added character. The back is going to be perfectly smooth when we're done, but the front, I prefer to keep some of that grain visible and some of that texture available. So it's still going to feel nice and smooth, but with that grain still kind of in there a little bit. So once I get it flattened out with the beam as much as I want, I go in with the 1000 grit Mirka Abralon pad here, and I'm just kind of making sure that everything's well leveled and whatnot, and everything's well sanded. It's not a huge issue because we're using the nitrocellulose lacquer, so it melts into itself, and we don't necessarily need to sand between coats because of that. But still, this takes off any nibbing or any imperfections that we have on there so that we don't have to worry about them as we go forward. Now, as I get through my next couple coats here, I'm going to have to resand all of this for the polishing process. And what I end up doing on this one is a semi-gloss on the front and a full gloss on the back. So Semi-gloss just worked better with that grain that was in there, and of course the full gloss on the back wasn't a problem because the back is nice and smooth and flat, and it's got that really nice gold work that I did to it to get that semi-transparent look, so I really want to show that off with the added depth of a gloss finish. I'm using the same lacquer for both, of course, and I'm not using a matting agent or anything like that. The change comes in the way that I polish. Now, in many cases, satin and semi-gloss finishes are supposed to be straight off the gun, but you can certainly polish to a semi-gloss finish if you're careful and you understand how to do so, and we're kind of going to cover that briefly in this video. It's fairly straightforward, it just requires some care and attention. So, finishing off the leveling on the back with the beam right now, and then we're going to move on to the spraying after we get our final kind of sand job done with the Mirka Abralon. These Abralon pads, I've got 1,000 grit, 2,000 grit, and 4,000 grit, and they're very helpful for this part of the process and also for the polishing, so I recommend them. I like them. I also like the 3M Trizact. The problem with all of these high grit, fancier pads with the foam on them and stuff is they're a little bit more expensive, but if you're interested in picking up some of these 6-inch Abralon pads, they are linked in the description in the Amazon link, along with a lot of the other stuff I use. The sanding beam and the guitar kit itself are in the Solo Music Gear link, of course. The gun is in the Warwick link that I'm using right now, and certainly all of the Mohawk products that I've used throughout this project are available through the Amazon link as well. There's a Mohawk/Bellin list in there where you can find all of that if you want. So those are all affiliate links, and they help me out if you do choose to use them, so feel free if you're interested in that. So I'm going through now with the nitrocellulose lacquer. Again, this is the classic instrument lacquer from Mohawk, and I'm just adding a couple more coats. This is all in real time, what you're seeing here. Some of the sanding, of course, was sped up, but the spraying here is real time, so you can see how fast I do it. I'm going over my strokes 50% like I always do, but because this is nitro lacquer, I'm going over pretty quickly and just adding extra passes. This stuff dries crazy fast in terms of being able to recoat, so don't worry about that too much. It's literally a few seconds. So I'm going in again here. I did leave about 10 minutes between full coats, but between those passes, you can get those done really quick. So I'm going in again for my second one here. I think I probably ended up doing a third one off camera, but the total number of coats isn't really the point here. I believe, generally speaking, when I'm doing a nitro job, I end up with somewhere between 4 and 8. Occasionally a little bit more than that if I'm trying to really bury some grain, but I do that more in the sealer stages, so you shouldn't be relying on a ton of coats of nitro to get that done. That should be dealt with the sealer, or better yet, with a grain filler, depending on what kind of grain you're working on. All right, guys, that's all the paint. That looks awesome as far as I'm concerned. Got that cool semi-transparent gold on the back. So we're gonna get to work on the polishing now, and I'm gonna use mostly the Mohawk Buff and Polish kit. This thing comes with some micro mesh, a couple different polishes. If you're really interested in this guy, obviously you can get in the link in the description, the Amazon link in the Mohawk list, but I'm gonna do another quick video, and I'll put a card for you to click on if you wanna see it, where we kind of go into more detail about this kit specifically. For this particular guitar, because that's great for polishing out, small scratches, and for polishing out a finish in general, and generally speaking, it's what I recommend for lacquer in a lot of cases. But in this case, because we have that grain in the top, we're gonna have to go a little more aggressive on some of the sanding to start with. So I'm gonna use my Dynabrade pneumatic sander like I do for my polyurethane finishes, because you need something a little more aggressive for those generally. Link in the description for that as well, of course, and some Mirka Abralon pads. I use these a fair bit now. I also use the 3M Trizact. These things are great. They've got some padding to them. They don't wear down very easily. I really like them. They're a little on the pricier side in terms of sandpaper. They're what I'm going to use for this. They're what I use for a lot of the more professional finishes. But again, a little bit more on the pricey side. You can check those out as well if you want. So we're going to start with those and then move on to the Buff and Polish kit, which has some insane micro mesh in it. It goes super high and should make things really easy to polish out. Let's get to work on that. Again, different video for that if you want. So we're jumping back into some more leveling work here. This time we're starting with the pneumatic sander just because it's going to get it started a little bit quicker, and we'll move into some block sanding later with some micro mesh from the Buff and Polish kit.
I'm using my Dynabrade sander here. It's the one that I use for all my stuff. I know I've said this about a couple other things, but hey, it's available in the description if you're looking for one. Dual action orbital works really well for this sort of stuff. So the foam pads for these Abralon kits they're good, but they're a little bit difficult to use for level sanding. So generally speaking, I like to use something like, well, this sander with a non-foam backed pad to get the process started, and then I come in with these after for the final finish work. But for this front in particular, it's not a big deal. This is going to look great. And when I go to do the back, I also don't have an issue there because the back is really nice and level, the paint laid out nicely, so this really just finishes the job off for that. And again, we are going to move to a block at the end when we move up to the insanely high grits that the micro mesh comes in, which are going to make it really easy to finish polishing this thing. In fact, the highest grits basically are semi-gloss when you're done with them. So I'm just using my compressor here to clean off my paper. You can also use a rag and run the sander against it, but I find the compressor more effective. It's helpful to keep your paper clean. It allows it to abrade more easily and generally just work more effectively, and it avoids situations with pilling, because if your paint does happen to pill up on your paper at all, you're basically using that big clump of paint as another abrasive, and it can cause scratching in your finish. So pay a little bit of attention to the state of your sandpaper as you're continuing this. I've done several sand and polish jobs with this one set of Abralon, so the 1000 grit, 2000 grit, and 4000 grit. The pads do last quite a while. I think the 3M Trizact ones actually last a little bit longer in my experience, but still, you can get a lot of work out of one of these if you maintain it. It's not like your standard high-load sandpaper that is only really good for a few minutes or a part of a job. This stuff will get you through several jobs as long as you pay attention to what you're doing, keep it clean, and don't use it on a finish that isn't fully dry. So I go through with my 1000 grit and get this all dealt with, and then I come back in with the 2000 grit after that, and I end up following that up with the 4000 grit to get this all really nice and smooth, and frankly, that's perfectly adequate, and you could polish from there, but I do want to do some work with a sanding block and take advantage of that micro mesh that comes in the buff and polish kit. So after I'm done going in with the 2000 grit and the 4000 grit, I'm going to do that next, and I'm going to jump right to, I think, the 8000 grit, although there is 6000 in that kit as well. The final micro mesh in the buff and polish kit is a 12,000 grit, which frankly is wildly unnecessary in almost any circumstance, but it's there, so we're going to use it. And you'll see, I think, from the demo here, as I finish up with the 12,000 grit, yeah, we're basically sitting at a semi-gloss finish, like I said, and then it's just a matter of taking a little bit of polish to it after to get it finished off and make sure that we're dealing with a gloss. There are two different polishes here. There's the medium and then the fine, or extra fine rather, which is to take out the swirl marks or any scratches from the medium. But if you're going to do a semi-gloss like I'm doing on the front of this one, you got to be careful that you don't do too much polishing after the 12,000. You just basically want a nice light pass over with the medium, and that'll sort it out. There's more than one way to do a semi-gloss finish, of course. I've shown you guys before that it can also be done using steel wool and paste finishing wax, or sanding to a very, very high grit, depending on what level of semi-gloss you want. You can kind of get a range almost from satin to pretty close to a full gloss. So I really like semi-gloss finishes. I feel like they've got more of a vintage feel and look to them, and I enjoy using them particularly on these kind of Telecaster style guitars or anything that is done with nitrocellulose, but it works with pretty much any type of finish you want. For example, that Ultimate SG kit that I'm doing in an upcoming series here, that one's going to be vintage semi-gloss as well, and that's also going to be done using a gloss finish and then polishing it to a semi-gloss, but that one will be with a 2K polyurethane, so that should be interesting. That'll be coming up soon. What I'm doing now is I'm wiping down the back of this thing, just making sure everything's clean. I'm using some naphtha to do that and remove any dust so that I don't have to worry about the coarser dust getting in the way. And then I've got the micro mesh from the Buff and Polish kit using their flat machined cork piece that really grips it nicely. That's what I'm using as my block to start with here. And this, like I said, is the 8000 grit, I believe. And I just go in and make sure that everything is nice and level. So getting everything level is important and a critical part of polishing, really. And sometimes you can do that with the foam back sanding pads, and sometimes it's a little bit more challenging. So in this case, I got it very close with those, and I got it very smooth. And now I'm finishing that off and taking off the scratches from that 4000 grit with this 8000 grit paper. I ended up switching to a sanding block here because it's just got a slightly wider surface area. The Buff and Polish kit is great for this sort of thing, but it's also kind of designed for spot repair. So it's good for taking out scratches and stuff like this. If you want a slightly faster method of getting to a full surface polish like this, I use a sanding block. It just kind of speeds up the process a little bit. So I'm doing that, and then I'll, of course, clean again. It's very important to clean periodically throughout the polishing process and the sanding process. You want to remove those harsher, coarser pieces of dust from prior sanding. And then as we move through the polishing process, you actually want to do the same thing, clean and make sure that you've taken off any of the polish from the prior step, because as you move through to a finer polish, you don't want that older stuff creating more abrasion and basically hindering your progress. One other thing I will say here before we finish off our prolonged sanding montage is you're going to want to stick with one direction when you're doing it by hand. So you'll notice I'm doing linear across the top of the body, and you will have seen I did the same thing when I was using the sanding beam earlier. You can't really help it when it comes to using an orbital. It's supposed to be faster, but when you're doing it by hand, stick to the one direction. It does give you a slightly smoother finish when all said and done, because you don't have those minute scratches kind of crisscrossing throughout. You've just got them going in one direction. So now I'm moving on to the polish from the Buff and Polish kit. This is the medium, and I load up the pad a little bit. Go figure, the pad's also available in the description. These pads have been awesome. They're way better than the ones I was using before in my old polishing videos. I'm really happy with them. I also have a rotary polisher that actually fits them, that's 5-inch. But for guitars, for some reason, I just like using the 3-inch polisher and doing it kind of, one hand and going through this way. So this is how I like to proceed. Make sure you load up your pad with a little bit of the polish first. You don't want too much of it. You can see I'm not using a whole lot, but I did put some all over the surface of the pad to begin with so that I don't have any dry foam that's kind of squeaking against the guitar. Now, for some reason, right where that light is hitting on the left side, you'll see when I move here, there seem to be some imperfections. Those don't show up from where I'm standing, and in fact, they don't show up in the final finish. So that's kind of odd. I'm just noticing them in the video now, but that's probably just some haziness in the surface. You'll see when I show you the finished product that, well, that's not there. So I do a couple passes with this medium polish. As I move up to the next polish, I also change pads. So the set of polishing pads comes in various degrees of coarseness. So there are some more aggressive ones for the compounding stage and that sort of thing, and then some lighter ones. They're all different colors. Some lighter ones for the polishing, and then some even lighter ones, or even softer, finer pads for kind of the glazing process at the end. But the polishing process here, this is a 2-step. So I'm starting with that green pad and the medium, and now I'm moving on to the super fine or ultra fine or whatever it's called, and finishing this off. So it's a pretty fast process, not all that many steps. Works great for this nitrocellulose lacquer. Can also work on polyurethanes, but they are a bit harder. So polyurethanes are generally a little more plasticky, a little glossier sometimes, but more difficult to polish because they're a harder finish. And you have to be more cognizant of your timing. You have to, like with a catalyzed polyurethane, you have to sand it basically the next day and polish it right away, or it becomes much more difficult. And some of them harden more than others, so you also have to be careful and think about which one you're using. Some of them end up pretty much rock hard. If you leave them for a week, you're going to have a real tough time. Luckily, nitrocellulose isn't like that. It's pretty straightforward to polish. And you can see kind of already, without me even cleaning off the haze here, you're getting the reflections of the bottles in the back and everything. It's looking pretty good, and it was a pretty fast process to do this. The sanding is, of course, the most time-consuming part. Polishing by hand with this stuff is also possible, and that's what I demonstrated in my video on how to use this buff and polish kit, because the kit doesn't come with a rotary polisher, obviously. You can certainly do that, and again, it's not all that time consuming, particularly if you're sanding to those really high grits like 12,000. You'll notice it's actually pretty easy to polish by hand, but you have to be careful about what you're using. If you're using a polishing pad, some kind of foam pad, that kind of thing, that's fine as long as it's nice and soft. I used a cotton piece from an old t-shirt that had been through the dryer enough times not to have a bunch of lint on it. That's my go-to for the hand polishing. Microfiber, I get a lot of people getting in touch with me saying they used microfiber, and then they're trying to figure out why there are scratches. So as I said in that video, well, microfiber is designed to be nice and soft, which it is, but it's also, they kind of tell you it won't scratch anything, and I disagree with that. It does tend to leave scratches when you're polishing with it. I have had someone disagree with me on that point, but I've seen it happen, and I've corrected a lot of people's problems by just saying, hey, are you using microfiber to polish? Switch to an old t-shirt, switch to a soft cotton rag, and generally that's sorted out the issue. So my recommendation is that you don't use microfiber when you're doing your polishing work. You can use it to clean off the excess polish after, but it's not for buffing. So here's the back. This is our full gloss, like I said. You can see that the camera is, instead of focusing on the guitar itself, it's focusing right on the lights, and for me that's kind of the sign that it's good. I've done a good job. It looks nice. There's still a little bit of haze on there that needs to be cleaned off a little better, but that won't be a problem. I'll either get it with a cloth or with the belly of my shirt as I play this thing to demo it. So looking good as far as I'm concerned.
Well, there we go, guys. That is the finishing on the body complete. Semi-gloss on top, like we talked about, or like I talked about, and full gloss on the back. Yeah, obviously happy with this. Okay, so in the next video, we're gonna finish the neck. We're gonna do it using modified tongue oil from Mohawk, because we're using Mohawk for everything on this build, and that's part of why it's going so well. And that's my favorite, basically my favorite oil, one of my favorite finishing products, period. So we're gonna do that in the next one, and then after that, it's gonna be time to get this thing put back together. As always, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please feel free to give it a thumbs up. I would appreciate it. Remember to subscribe so you can see how this thing ends up and listen to me play it, which is something you may actually want to skip. And yeah, thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one. Have a good one.